Good evening from India. On behalf of ORF and RIS, it gives me great pleasure in inviting you to the closing plenary of the BRICS Academic Forum 2021. This session is titled Towards Reformed Multilateralism. This is an important topic, of course, and I'd like to set the context by recalling 4 domains in which this discussion is taking place around the world. First, of course, is a global discourse that is taking place on the reform of multilateral institutions and multilateral forums, whether it's the G20, the G4, and the G24. There are a lot of proposals already on the table worldwide on how we can reform the multilateral system. Second, of course, is BRICS and our priorities towards multilateral forums and institutions. We know that BRICS was born out of a challenge to Bretton Woods institutions and also to reshape global multilateral system. Over the years, of course, BRICS has made several attempts to reshape the global multilateral political as well as the economic architecture. This year, under India's presidency, the BRICS Foreign Minister's statement has issued a seminal joint statement on strengthening and reforming the multilateral system. Of course, the statement reflects a wide range of issues that indicates how BRICS leaders want to approach multilateralism and the reform of multilateralism. The third is, of course, India and our priorities towards multilateralism. India is finding itself in a very unique moment. We are chairing the BRICS in 2021. We have the presidency of the United Nations Security Council this month, August 2021. But of course, we are elected membership for the next 2 years. India was elected as the chair of the WHO Executive Board in 2020. We are designated to chair the G20 in 2023. And just yesterday, an Indian officer has been elected as the next executive director of RECAP, the Regional Cooperation Agreement on Combating Piracy and Armed Robbery against Ships in Asia. This is based in Singapore. Therefore, India's own engagement with multilateral institutions and forums has been on hyperdrive. And this issue is very important to India. And last, of course, is the BRICS academic process. Multilateralism was one of the 4 key themes in 2021. We have a section dedicated to it in the essays compendium we've launched this week. And we've also organized a BRICS academic dialogue on multilateralism in April 2021. First in the series of dialogues that we did under the BRICS academic process this year. Therefore, it's clear that this is a burning issue even for the academic forum. I have 2 questions for the panelists. First, how can the multilateral system be reformed to adapt to the realities of today's world? And second, what specific measures do we need to reform the UN, its principal organs, and the institutions like IMF and the World Bank and WHO and WTO? We have a high-level panel, and we will begin with a 5-minute opening remark by each of the panelists. And based on the remarks, I will then continue to moderate the rest of the discussion. Let me first start with our Brazilian colleague, André Mello, researcher with the Institute for Applied Economic Research, Ipea in Brazil, for his opening remark for this session today. Over to you. André, I think you have to mute.
Yeah, my apologies, I was on mute. But starting again, many thanks, Chair, and thank you for your introduction. As you rightly remind us, the main original objective of the BRICS was to reform Bretton Woods institutions. And as your first question that was presented to us points out, there were a lot of changes that took place since these institutions were created in the post-war period, which suggests that multilateralism today surely needs to be very different from the one in that period. And so multilateralism is clearly undergoing a crisis. And if we want to reform it, somehow we need to understand the origins and the causes of this crisis. The crisis is manifested in 2 main dimensions. First, we have a considerable fragmentation of multilateral institutions in different issue areas. which are often cross-cutting, overlapping, and even contradictory. And that arguably reduces the efficiency of the system as a whole. And secondly, we also have a weakening of these institutions. And by that I mean they tend to be less legally binding. They have fewer or non-existent enforcement mechanisms. And so if we want a stronger multilateral system, we need to address those problems. And so how should the BRICS proceed in reforming the multilateral system? Well, here I would argue the BRICS should pay attention to two main attributes of the system, which is inclusiveness and effectiveness. And they oftentimes are presented as trade-offs, meaning the more inclusive the system is, the less effective or efficient it tends to be. So this is a challenge. But to reach inclusiveness, we need to include civil society and those least developed countries that oftentimes have been marginalized from the multilateral system. And this needs to be done not only by ensuring a seat at the table, by formal representation, if you will, but also by ensuring that these stakeholders have effective decisional participation or have influence in the decision-making process. So this will ensure that the system has a sufficient degree of legitimacy, which is crucial not only for its acceptance, but also for compliance of states in the international community as a whole. Now, BRICS should also recognize that the new forms of global governance are very different from the one that we saw in the post-war period. The old school UN model is no longer followed in the newer institutions. So, and one of the characteristics of the newer models of global governance is precisely that they allow for greater input from these previously marginalized stakeholders. Another one is that they also tend to give more space and decision-making influence to private actors. Actually, a lot of the new institutions are hybrid institutions, public-private partnerships, or even entirely private institutions. And so this brings new challenges as well as opportunities. On the one hand, we need the expertise and the resources of the private sector, and we cannot afford to do without them. But on the other hand, we run the risk of some private stakeholders overriding the entire process and setting the agenda and having a lot more influence in the decisions and the outcomes than states themselves. And a case in point here would be the Gates Foundation in the issue area of global health governance. And finally, multilateralism nowadays also requires a lot more technical knowledge and expertise than before. So this reminds us that the BRICS, in order to be effective in their negotiations in multilateral settings, they need to invest a lot more in research and in generating this knowledge, because this knowledge has become itself a source of power and of and actually a source of strength in bargaining in these settings. So these would be, I think, the main considerations overall for how BRICS should attempt to reform the multilateral system. Obviously, there are a lot of differences that vary according to the issue area of multilateralism that we're looking at. But in general, I would point out these would be the main issues that need to be taken into account. And I'll stop here a little bit short of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, André, and thank you for respecting the time limit. And your point about fragmentation and weakening and inclusivity, and particularly on expertise, is very well taken. And we have seen how some of the multilateral institutions are now delegating and leveraging other bodies outside of their system for technical expertise. And so I think that point is very well taken. And perhaps I can come back to you in the second round to ask what are some of the good examples and best practices that we can learn to reform the multilateral system from some of these things that you have said. For instance, how do we actually create a system where we can get the inputs of civil society and private enterprise without getting drowned out by their influence? Thank you very much. The next speaker today for the opening statement, Mr. Yaroslav Lisovolik, Program Director, Valdai Discussion Club. Over to you, Yaroslav.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Moscow. It is a great pleasure to have this opportunity to present to you our views on multilateralism at this crucial stage for the global community, for the global economy. Clearly, multilateralism is something that we need tremendously during a crisis like this, and I would agree with Vyacheslav Nikonov, my compatriot who already spoke, I think, in this forum, who stated that probably in some respects we can say that the BRICS has fallen somewhat behind in terms of delivering on boosting the forces of multilateralism during this crisis and dealing with the current downturn. There could have been more that could be done. And I think clearly during this crisis, we see that the old multilateralism and old institutions, they are not capable of meeting the challenges that are very significant now, and there may be a need for new multilateralism that could be delivered and that could be strengthened precisely by BRICS and their resources represented by the economies themselves, the BRICS, but also their regional partners and the forces of regionalism that could be brought by the BRICS economies. So accordingly, in discussing or answering the question that was posed initially with regard to what are the possible venues for reforming the system, my proposition would be to look at the possibility of forming new platforms that bring together the old institutions of multilateralism, the Bretton Woods institutions, etc., and the new institutions, the development institutions of BRICS, and the regional development institutions where BRICS countries are members. So accordingly, for example, if we're looking at the development spheres that are covered by the World Bank, we can look at the new development bank being an important partner with the World Bank, together with the regional development banks where BRICS countries are members. We look at the IMF, and on the other side, from the BRICS side, we have the CRA, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement of BRICS, and the regional financing institutions where BRICS countries are members. Actually, such platforms have already been to some degree explored by the IMF, by the G20, in bringing together regional financing institutions and the IMF. And then we can also look at the WTO, the regional integration arrangements represented by the BRICS economies. And we can look at the possibility of the BRICS economies forming their own bloc, a BRICS bloc within the World Trade Organization, in order to counter some of the protectionism that we see that is quite rampant actually during this crisis in the world economy. Other possible platforms that could boost multilateralism, perhaps we could explore a potential platform for sovereign wealth funds. And we've seen that the sovereign wealth funds have been quite active in dealing with issues related to health, to vaccines, to green development. Perhaps a platform like that could be important in addressing these issues and in building cooperation links with the World Health Organization. So basically, my answer to your question would be that the BRICS are capable of delivering their part to boosting multilateralism, including through the resources of the regional institutions where they're members. Thank you.
Thank you so much for respecting time also, Yaroslav. In fact, you've moved the discussion forward from what André was saying in a way to actually suggest that there are ideas and concepts out there where you can create new platforms, possibly where the old and the new and the regional platforms can all come together. And perhaps in the next round, you can maybe give some guiding principles or some characteristics of what that platform can possibly look like. I know you mentioned BRICS bloc at WTO and Sovereign Wealth Fund. Perhaps you can expound on that a little bit more.
With pleasure. Thank you.
Let me now come to our third speaker, which is Dr. Jin Xing, the Secretary General, China Council for BRICS Think Tank Cooperation. Over to you, Dr. Jin.
Thank you, moderator. Hello, everybody. Good evening from Beijing. 今天讨论主题是多边主义。新冠病毒疫情告诉我们了，人类是脆弱的，单一的病毒就能改变我们的工作和生活状况。
Today we will talk about multilateralism, and indeed, the pandemic has told us that humanity is very vulnerable. Even one virus will change our life and work.
新冠病毒同时告诉我们了，人类是相互依存的命运共同体。只要一个国家控制不了疫情的话，人类就很难说是安全。
But the pandemic has also told us that humanity are a community with a shared future. If there is still one country that fails to combat the virus, the whole humanity is far from security.
联合国193个成员国就如同一条船上的水手，尽管大家肤色、民族信仰不同，但是大家必须齐心努力，朝着共同目标来迈进才能建设更加美好的世界。
I believe 193 members of the UN are just like sailors on the same boat. Despite differences in skin colors, nationalities, and beliefs, we have to work together towards the same objective to build a better world.
只有实行真正的多边主义，人类才能避免战争、摆脱贫困和远离疾病。
True multilateralism will be the only solution for us to avoid wars, get rid of poverty, and be far from disease.
那么我们究竟需要什么样的多边主义？我想我们应该需要开放包容的多边主义，不能搞有选择的多边主义。
Well, what kind of multilateralism do we need? I believe we need open and inclusive multilateralism instead of selective multilateralism.
搞俱乐部式的多边主义，本国优先的多边主义，只会使世界推向分裂甚至对抗。
Practices to form exclusive clubs or put one's own interests above everything else will only lead us to separation or even confrontation.
当前我们应该坚持责任共担、利益共享，来增强全球性多边机制和一些区域合作机制的开放性和包容性。
We should stand for the sharing of responsibilities and benefits so as to strengthen or enhance the inclusiveness and openness of global multilateralism and some regional cooperative mechanisms.
我们也需要坚持以国际法为基础的多边主义，坚定维护以联合国为核心的国际体系，以国际法为基础的国际秩序，来维护和加强现有国际多边机构的权威性和有效性。
We should also uphold multilateralism based on international law. That is to say, we need to firmly uphold the UN-centered international system and the international order based on international law to safeguard and strengthen the authority and effectiveness of current international multilateral mechanisms.
我们还应该坚持协商合作的多边主义。各国，特别是包括金砖国家在内的主要经济体，当前应该加强宏观经济政策协调。来促进发展战略对接。
We should also uphold multilateralism based on extensive coordination, consultation, and cooperation. Countries, including or especially BRICS countries and other major economies, should strengthen macroeconomic policy coordination, link up development strategies.
同时我们要坚持与时俱进的多边主义。当前要加强在世贸组织和国际货币基金组织和世界银行等金融机构的改革方面，我们要加强协调。
And we also need to uphold multilateralism that will keep up with the times. We should facilitate the reform of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and World Bank, along with other international financial institutions.
我们还应该参与网络空间治理、数字贸易等新领域的规则的制定，来共同发出精确的适应。形成符合新兴经济体和广大发展国家利益的共同方案。
We should also participate in the rulemaking of new areas, including the cyberspace and digital trade, to jointly express BRICS voices and to draft or form a joint plan that meets the interests and benefits of emerging economies and developing countries.
我们还要鼓励金砖国家新开发银行等新的机构发挥更大的作用，鼓励搭建更多的有利于全球和区域治理的新的平台、新的机制，来弥补现有的国际多边机制的不足。
And we should encourage new institutions like the New Development Bank to play a bigger role, to encourage the building of new platforms and new mechanisms that will do good to international and regional governance, so as to fill in the gap or to shore up the difficulties faced by the multilateralism currently.
我们还鼓励更多的国际关系行为体参与到全球治理中来譬如说像 NGO 像工商界、智库私营机构等等，应该共同参与到全球治理中来，为完善全球治理来做增量。
We look forward and encourage the participation of more players into the global governance, not limited to NGOs, think tanks, and private entities.
好，我的发言完了。
That's all about my remarks. Thank you.
Dr. Jin, thank you very much for keeping within time, and I have deep respect because I understand you're using a translator. We take your point very well about the open and inclusive system, and also being maybe rule makers in certain areas. And perhaps you can explain that in our second round a little bit on what are some of those issues in which we can do better rule making than what we have done so far. I'm going to now turn to our South African panelist, Dr. Philani Tembu. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue from South Africa. Dr. Tembu, are you with us? Okay. Why don't I do this? Why don't I actually go to Ambassador Viswanathan? Dr. Tembu, are you with us?
I am with you. I just lost connection for a few seconds.
Okay, all right. Well, I welcome you, and I welcome you to give your opening statement.
Excellent. Thank you very much, colleagues. A few points I would like to just add to this discussion. The first one is really around how the rise of Southern powers, which is reflected also in the establishment of structures such as the BRICS, how it has moved the world, into a more multipolar order. Now, what that entails is that there is a need for new thinking. There is a need for global governance reforms. But there's also a need for new institutions in order to solve the current and pressing global problems. Because we are living in a world that is vastly different from the one which was there at the founding of many of these multilateral institutions. And a key task for BRICS countries is not only to strengthen multilateralism and to ensure resilience within the multilateral framework. But a key task for the BRICS countries will also be in how we can act as a bridge between the global south and the global north in order to build a new multilateral architecture. We need all of these countries to work together, and nothing has showed us that more than the current pandemic. When we don't work together, we are seeing the results of that. The second point is really around how the BRICS countries can draw from their own internal cooperation in order to strengthen multilateral institutions. I think it must be commended what the BRICS countries have done. If you think about it on an annual basis, you have at least over 100 meetings that are taking place amongst BRICS countries. And these meetings are not taking place only amongst state actors. They are taking place amongst think tanks, amongst the academia, amongst civil society actors, and within the private sector. Now, I think we can draw on those lessons that we have learned from BRICS cooperation to take into existing structures of multilateralism. And what that helps is to bring in a multiple track diplomacy approach, which we have seen within the BRICS, which means that as state actors move forward in their cooperation, they don't leave behind non-state actors. And in fact, non-state actors play an integral role, because what we've seen is that irrespective of the changes of government that take place amongst the BRICS countries, you have a dense network of interaction and cooperation that is taking place amongst non-state actors, which actually outlives each of the respective governments. That is very important. A third point is really around, if we incorporate some of these lessons, we can help in order to ensure that we're moving towards a less fragmented multilateral order and building greater resilience. Now, we know that the BRICS countries' efforts have largely focused on the UN Security Council reforms, on the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. But what is also important is that BRICS countries have sought to reform these structures from within, while also applying pressure from outside of these structures by forming new institutions, such as the New Development Bank. And I think all of that adds to the pressure for greater reform. What's also going to be important, I think, to take into account is that the existing powers in the global north should not look at the reform efforts of BRICS countries as a threat to their authority. Instead, they should look at it as an addition that will actually improve the resilience of these structures. And therefore, we should take into account that when we look at the multilateral system over the last few decades, it has largely been homogeneous. There has not been a heterogeneity of thinking and of thought. And it means that we have not had an injection of fresh ideas into existing multilateral structures. And therefore, the formation of BRICS and their efforts at greater inclusiveness and their efforts at building resilience must be seen as added value into the existing structures of multilateralism. If we do that, I think we'll be able to build a more inclusive, but also a more resilient architecture of multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for sticking within time. We're doing very well in this session, touch wood. So on to our last speaker. And Dr. Filani, I'll come back to you because I have some questions on non-state actors and how they can be brought into the system for feedback. Ambassador Viswanathan, last, because we are the host this year. So as the Indian speaker, you get to go last. But your views on the opening question: how can the multilateral system be reformed to adapt to the reality of the world?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, let me say it's a great honor and privilege for me to participate in this with such a distinguished panelists. Now, on the very specific questions you have asked, I have 4 points to make. The first is, what is reformed multilateralism and what are its characteristics? Today's multilateralism came into being after the Second World War and has survived with a few tinkerings here and there. In an ideal world, the norms of a multilateral system and the rules of global institutions should be loaded in favor of the weak, and it should incentivize the strong to strengthen the weak. But unfortunately, we don't live in a world which is perfect or ideal. But there is no need for despair or loss of hope, because multilateralism of sorts has evolved over the last few decades. But it is true that it has become totally outdated, particularly with the emergence of new emerging economies. Now, even though there is no precise definition of what a reformed multilateralism would be, practically everyone agrees that there are some fundamentals. It has to be representative it has to be inclusive, it has to be democratic, equitable, and it has to be beneficial for everyone, both the powerful and the weak, the rich and the poor, the big and the small, the developed and the developing. I come to the second point by asking this question: why is this question of reformed multilateralism so important today? It is important because of special circumstances. In the past decade, the multilateral system has taken a heavy beating and is on the back foot. Many nations and societies are losing their faith in the efficacy of the multilateral system. Hence, there is a growing voice, both among the developed and the developing world, that we need to revive the system. But the fear here is that in our hurry to revive the system, we should not reinstate the old system with all its flaws and accentuate the contradictions and iniquities. We should use this inflection point to establish a new system with substantial reforms so that it is reinvigorated and ready to address the new challenges of the 21st century. The third point I would take the example of the United Nations and see what lessons we can draw from them. Since 1991, we have been talking about the reforms of the UN in general and the expansion of the Security Council in particular. However, there has been no forward movement at all. Everybody agrees that the UNSC today does not reflect the global geopolitical and geoeconomic realities. Unless the UNSC in particular and the UN in general are reformed in a time-bound manner, it will become irrelevant and marginal. Nations will form their own mini-laterals to address address issues of importance to them. We saw such a phenomenon in WTO, where due to the failure to have a global rule-based trading system, many free trade areas came into being. On the question of the expansion of the Security Council, there are some who argue that a larger council will be less effective. This goes against the fundamental principle of representation, which alone gives legitimacy to an organization. As André pointed out very well, there should be a balance between legitimacy and efficacy. Without efficacy, the organization will slowly become powerless to maintain order. And without legitimacy, it will eventually unravel and become non-existent. My last point is, how can BRICS contribute in this important question of reformed multilateralism? In my view, it is ideally suited to take the lead in this initiative because it is not only a distinct but a very unique grouping. It has proved that it has a capacity to create new institutions like the NDB and the CRA. Further, global governance has always been an area of priority for BRICS. Hence, BRICS should come up with some initiatives. And on the question of the UNSC expansion, the fact that there has been so far no convergence of views is actually seen as a weakness by the critics of BRICS. Now we have to prove the critics to be wrong and come up with concrete ideas on this question. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Viswanathan. So that was some insightful opening statements. If I were to draw a common thread with all the 5 opening statements, it is clear that openness, inclusivity, greater voices, whether it's sector or civil society, whether it is non-state actors, is important for legitimacy. It is important for solving global problems. That has become clear. So the question that I turn to all of you for the second round is, what are then the new ways in which we can ensure, what are the structures, what are the formats, what are the specific reforms we can do to ensure that the multilateral system that we need reflects inclusivity, reflects openness, reflects legitimacy. So I want to start with, I'll switch it up a little bit. I think Dr. Tembu and André were talking a little bit about non-state actors and society and private institutions. So maybe I'll come to you both first. If you can give a little bit more shape, and starting with you, Dr. Tembu, like how can we improve participation of the non-state actors, as you have put in your first round?
Excellent. I think in our efforts to reform, let's say, the multilateral structures, let me give you an example of the UN system. Whilst the Security Council is absolutely important and must be reformed, we should not only focus on the Security Council. We need to focus on actually how do we simultaneously empower some of the other structures of the UN system as a whole. So yes, fine, looking at the General Assembly, but also looking at the agencies of the UN and the various other structures of the UN, because often those structures have a direct linkage with multiple stakeholders, whether it's in the field of research, whether it's in the field of advocacy through civil society groupings. So if we strengthen some of those structures of the UN system, what it will help to do is to actually counter the overwhelming concentration of power within the UN Security Council. And it would aid our efforts in terms of democratizing the UN system. So I think what we have done within the BRICS grouping, that preceding these various summits, you have these various activities of the various stakeholders, civil society, think tanks. You need the same or similar process that actually leads up to various summits of or meetings of the WTO. You need similar meetings in the lead up, to meetings of the General Assembly, your annual meetings. So you need some structures, new structures, and reforming existing structures that will actually disseminate the views that are coming from non-state actors on a reformed multilateral system. And if we do that, then I think we get more legitimacy and we bring in additional voices, but we also bring in greater innovations within the existing structures.
Thank you. André?
Thank you, Akshay. Let me start out by pointing that when we speak of non-state actors, we are referring to a very heterogeneous category. Non-state actors are not all the same. And so when we say that in order for the new multilateral system to be legitimate, it needs to include non-state actors, I think that is correct. But we also need to qualify that statement, because if we look at the newer institutions in global governance, what we see is that usually big businesses and foundations, they're very well represented and they have a lot of bargaining power in these institutions. And on the other hand, non-governmental organizations as a whole, environmental, labor, consumer rights groups, and the like, they do not enjoy the same influence in the decision-making processes. They are, in other words, they're usually excluded from these processes. So if we want to include these previously excluded stakeholders, if we want greater legitimacy for multilateralism, we need to focus on those particular non-state actors that have not been given access to decision making. Again, even when they have a seat at the table, that does not mean that they have influence. They might, in other words, they might participate in the negotiation process, but that doesn't mean that they have a voice on the outcomes. And what we see is that typically these groups, they act as observators. They have an observational status, but again, they don't have a full membership, if you will. Now, reforming the existing institutions, as we well know, is very difficult too. And the BRICS have attempted primarily with the IMF and the World Bank, and the results have been, by and large, too little, too late. To the point where the BRICS themselves have decided to create their own alternative financial institutions, as has been already pointed out. And so, oftentimes, and somebody mentioned this here, I think it was Pilani, what we will need to do is go down that route and create new institutions. Other times we can somehow create institutions under the umbrella of what's already there. And a case in point is the World Health Organization, which is a traditional intergovernmental UN organization. It does not allow for non-state actor participation by and large, but what we see is that within the umbrella of the WHO, we have all these initiatives and new institutions springing up, such as UNAIDS, such as the ones that were created to fight malaria, tuberculosis, and other infections. And so this is perhaps another way to go, because changing the status quo is always, again, very difficult, and institutions are sticky, they are resilient, and they have a tremendous inertia. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yaroslav and Dr. Jin and Ambassador Viswanathan, the three of you seem to indicate that there are fundamental changes we can make in the existing architecture. And if we made that, that in itself would go a long way in addressing some of the concerns and making the multilateral more legitimate. Yaroslav, you spoke about maybe finding a way, a middle ground where new platforms and old platforms could come together. Jin, you were opening, you suggested maybe rulemaking in certain new areas in which there might be more cooperation that's possible. Ambassador Viswanathan, you spoke about maybe getting a little bit more consensus or at least more shared understanding within BRICS on certain key reform issues. So would that be enough? Can you speak a little bit more about that? So I'll start with you, Dr. Jin. What more do we need to do, or what specifically do we need to do in the existing system to ensure that it meets the standards and the expectations that you're setting for the future multilateral system?
我看来刚才很多人观点其实都很相似啊。我们觉得啊，现在对当前的多边机制啊，一个是存量呢要进行优化，同时呢增量呢要进行创新。
I find that actually panelists share many opinions. And I believe on the one hand, we need to optimize existing multilateral institutions. On the other, we need to make some innovations in creating some new.
对于存量的优化啊，并不是为了推翻现有的国际机制，而是使它能够更有效率。
To optimize, I don't mean that we need to overturn or even abandon current or existing multilateralism, but to make it more efficient.
特别是金砖国家作为一个发达国家、发展中国家的大国的这个合作的这个集团也好组织也好，完全可以在增量和存量方面都能做出贡献来。
And I believe BRICS countries, as prominent emerging countries and developing countries, we have the ability to do a better job in optimizing current multilateralism.
一方面呢，我们要继续推动现有的国际机构进行优化改革，譬如说刚刚联合国世界银行IMF 等等都要进行改革。另一方面，我觉得我们可以创造一些新的合作模式，譬如说在跨境数据安全气候变化在这个生物多样性保护包括信息安全、数字税收等的新的领域我们应该达成一些共识，发出我们共同声音。
And I have two suggestions. First, we need to reform current international institutions not limited to the UN, World Bank, or IMF. And second, we may explore some new cooperative modes. For example, we may find new cooperative modes in areas like the transborder digital information security, the climate change, and protection of biodiversity, along with the digital tax.
我很赞同刚才前面有朋友谈的，金砖国家还可以成为发达国家经济体和欠发达国家之间的一个桥梁和纽带。
And I agree with some of yours proposal that BRICS countries may provide or become bridge between developed countries and less developed countries.
譬如说，当下我们应该强调要疫苗多边主义的重要性，来呼吁各方来支持 WTO 继续推进新冠疫苗知识产权豁免。 呼吁多边金融机构和其他的国际组织为发展中国家，特别是欠发达国家来采购疫苗提供更多的融资支持。
For example, we should continue to call for the vaccine multilateralism. That is to say, on the one hand, we should call on the WTO to continue the waiving of IPR of the vaccines. On the other, we should encourage international financial institutions along with other international organizations to help developing countries, especially less developed countries, to easily buy vaccines.
因为很多欠发达国家，它获得疫苗的难度更大一没钱，二没技术因为有些发达国家有技术我们作为发展中国家大国，我们就应该呼吁成为一种桥梁纽带，来共同帮助一些欠发达国家能够解决这个疫苗的可普及性的问题。
Because it's especially difficult for less developed countries to have vaccines. For one thing, they lack money. For other, they lack technologies. And I know that maybe some developing countries, they acquire the technology to produce vaccines themselves. But for less developed countries, they fail to do that. And as the largest developing country, China stands ready to become the bridge to better help less developed countries to enhance the accessibility of vaccines.
那我就说这么多，要不就超时了。
I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yaroslav, to you.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. The proposals that I delivered regarding the possibility of creating new platforms that involve regional institutions essentially imply that regionalism should not be a liability, a burden, or a threat to multilateralism, but rather the reverse. It could well be a source of transformation and innovation in designing new patterns and new forms of multilateralism. I think one way to illustrate this would be to look at the anti-crisis measures that were launched and coordinated last year by the G20. And one of the ways to reinforce this anti-crisis impulse would have been to involve more regional development institutions and their tremendous resources in countering this downturn.
Ambassador Viswanathan?
Thank you, Chair. There are two questions here. One is creating new institutions, and the other is reforming the existing ones. Reforming is much easier than creating new institutions, unless, of course, the existing institutions are so flawed ab initio that we have to write them off. But fortunately, most of the global institutions today are not in that category. They can be reformed with changing times. And Dr. Jin spoke about this eloquently, so I agree with him. So I'll again go back to the example of the United Nations. And our South African colleague Filani mentioned about that. And I agree with him that we should, UN Security Council is not the only institution within the UN that needs reform. We should not be obsessed with that alone. ECOSOC, for example, it can be reformed to be more effective, more efficient, and more beneficial to the countries. And I'll come to the question of the General Assembly and say a few words there, because that's very important. The two main organs of the United Nations are the Security Council and the General Assembly. And the General Assembly today is perhaps the biggest multilateral forum in the world. But unfortunately, it doesn't have any teeth. So even though 197 nations, or I'm not sure about the number, of members, they are not able to do anything concretely. So the first thing that can be done is to look at a UN General Assembly and how to strengthen it, not as a kind of a rival to the Security Council, but a kind of a partnership with the Security Council. Can ways be found by which Security Council and General Assembly can work together in more issues, so that the countries feel that they have a stake in the system? I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Vishnu. In fact, you reminded us that even the BRICS joint statement on strengthening and reforming a multilateral system reiterate the centrality of some of these existing multilateral systems, such as nations, WTO, and it talks about certain areas in which the reforms can be made and certain principles that can be followed. And so it is not just, the statement is not asking for a new institution or an overhaul. It is saying we can maintain centrality, but still yet be able to make certain changes. So let me come back. There are some questions from the audience, and I will annotate those questions and direct them to our panelists here. So let me just paraphrase the list of questions that we have. So the audience is asking, how do we bridge the gap between global north and the south? That's one fault line, I suppose. How do we bridge the gap between the say the different heterogeneous actors? There's the government, there's business, there's civil society. And what is the best way to do that? Because it seems like what the world has responded with to ensure is with plurilaterals groupings, and which has led to its own set of issues. And so the question becomes, do we have the right model? Is plurilateral and minilateral the right model? We might try regional approaches, but is that the right model? Is it going to take away from the multilateral approach we need to take, or is it going to complement and make the multilateral system more cohesive and better? So what I'm going to do is, I think the first question I'm going to direct to Yaroslav to ask, how do we ensure that the specific reforms that are required to bridge the specific reforms that are required to bridge global north and south, how do we make sure that can happen?
Yes, thank you. My view is that what we need to see coming from the BRICS is greater activism in building platforms that are open and inclusive, and building new platforms that are significant in terms of trade, investment that can be important not just for the global north, but for not just for the global south, but for the global north as well. And then I think that some of the BRICS initiatives, they may involve certain outreach that includes not just the global south countries, not just the developing nations, but also possibilities for communication and cooperation with the developed economies. Perhaps one of the ways there could be the aggregation of regional integration arrangements where both developed and developing nations are members, such as RCEP, for example, one of the recent large-scale FTAs that was launched. Basically, I think it's a matter of launching platforms that are inclusive and are able to include both actors from the north and from the south.
André, let me come to you with the same question. That what way can we ensure that the north and the south are better represented? Have we created too many minilaterals and plurilaterals as a response to that, which is becoming ineffective in its own way?
I think we have, actually, and thank you for the question. The problem with the minilaterals and the plurilaterals, of course, is that they will not do if we want to provide the global public goods, right? And there has been a lot of talk of global public goods, particularly now where we're in the context of a pandemic. But if you have an arrangement that only includes a few number of countries, even if these are very important countries, they cannot provide for these goods. And in a context of globalization, obviously, of COVID-19 and of climate change, we need arrangements of global governance that will include all the major stakeholders and ideally all the countries in the world, in addition to the non-state actors we have mentioned. So that's my main concern with the plurilaterals. The other one is, sure, they may be a step towards multilateralism, towards a more comprehensive institutional setting. But they might also serve the other purpose of weakening what we already have in terms of multilateralism. And the area of trade, I think, is very illustrative of this danger, right? A lot of the FTAs have, in fact, served the purpose of weakening the WTO rather than, as was the intention of the so-called open regionalism, serving as a step towards the greater goal of expanded and strengthened WTO.
Thank you. I think that covers most of the questions, and we have 5 minutes left, so that's 1 minute to each of you. And I'd like you to give me a very, very, very short answer to this question, because this is a BRICS forum. It's a closing plenary. So the question to each of the speakers is this: what issue can BRICS take to reform the global multilateral system? So what are the one or two priorities you would give to the leaders? You've given a range of issues, suggestions to choose from, but how would you prioritize? Can you give one or two issues? So I'll start in a different order this time. I'll go with Dr. Jinxing first.
优先次序啊，就是优先次序。优先次序啊，就是
我很赞成啊，大家对你要说排序啊，确实很难啊。
Well, I think it's pretty difficult for me to prioritize one to another.
因为很多老的旧有的机构啊，现有的机构需要改革，新的呢还需要创新，它是同时进行的。
Because we need to, on the one hand, to reform existing institutions. On the other, to create new ones. They are in parallel.
我想，现有的国际机构啊，都需要再加强它的权威性和有效性。
And I think for all existing international institutions, we need to enhance their authority and effectiveness.
比如刚刚谈到的联合国大会。世卫组织大会其实都很重要。
For example, the ones you've mentioned, the Security Council or the World Health Assembly, they are important.
同时呢，我觉得我们要把新开发银行把它建设好。
But it doesn't mean that we need to pay less attention to the development of new development bank.
同时，我们金砖国家可以再创造一些新的合作平台。
And I believe maybe for our 5 countries, we also need to create more new platforms.
至于这些平台是哪些平台，我想我们智库可以再研究。
And what are they? Maybe we have further space to discuss among think tanks.
这些平台可以成为南南合作的一些桥梁。
And I believe these platforms will become bridge for the South-South cooperation.
好，我就说这么多。
I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Dr. Filani.
Thank you. I think if there's one thing we need to do, and also learning from the pandemic, is let us strengthen the ability, the capacity, and the agency of our respective regions to contribute to the multilateral institutions. Let's not look at these two as if they are somehow in conflict. If we strengthen the ability of regions to develop regional value chains, to contribute in terms of production, then they are able to make a much greater contribution to the provision of global public goods. And we've seen this within the BRICS. There has been an attempt since 2013 that each of the summits should also somehow bring in the role of the various regional actors. So if we do that, I think we'll strengthen the ability of regions to contribute to the strengthening of multilateralism.
Thank you. André?
Very briefly, I think the areas where the BRICS should prioritize in terms of multilateralism are the ones where they are in agreement. So with this in mind, I don't think the UN Security Council would be one of these priority areas, because 2 of the BRICS are already members of the council, and there's no agreement on how to reform it. Rather, I would suggest that 2 which actually are perhaps the two most important global public goods that we need to provide nowadays, which are related to health and climate change. So I think in these two areas, the BRICS are all in agreement, and they can make a significant impact because they're important stakeholders. And again, these are perhaps the two most pressing problems of our time. Thank you.
Thank you. Yaroslav, very quickly, please.
Yes, very quickly. Basically, I think that the challenge for the BRICS and what the BRICS can do is to build own platforms, not wait for the challenges to be addressed by developed economies. And one possibility for BRICS would be to create a layer of regional institutions and global governance that currently does not simply exist.
Thank you. Ambassador Viswanathan?
Just 2 points. Multilateral and plurilateral organizations should evolve in such a way that they can be dovetailed into the larger multilateral system and they don't work at cross purposes. And the second point is that the leaders, while talking of reformed multilateralism, should take a very long-term view and should not be influenced by short-term gains. Thank you.
And with that, I would only say that you've clearly highlighted the role and the need for a more open and inclusive multilateral system, more focus on regional platforms, more focus on certain areas of the existing multilateral architecture, such as the United Nations or principal organs of the UN, which can be reformed, new areas like health and climate change on which we can work. And so I think the agenda is full. A lot of it is on our plate as researchers to look into it as we move forward, perhaps into the next BRICS academic process for 2022. With that, I want to thank the panelists for joining us today and welcome you to attend the validatory session. Thank you.